Cheesing is a term in gaming referring to overcoming obstacles or beating enemies through tactics that are not exactly cheating, but are considered cheap, not honorable, or cringe. The cheeser exploits systemic quirks or apparent design oversights to gain maximum advantage for minimal skill or effort, which sits wrong with many gamers across the globe. In Apex, cheese strats and compositions generally have a very one-dimensional playstyle where they are incredibly strong at one particular thing, but fall short when it comes to adjusting and being more dynamic as is required in a game like Apex. This adds even more frustrations to those who die to these cheesy strats because the teams who utilize them very rarely make it into the late game or get any good points of their own. To the cheesed, it almost feels like they're being griefed. So let's take a look at some of the cheesiest strats that we've seen in Apex's history, go over how they worked and just how deadly that they could be. Let's start off with the most infamous team composition, Revtane. Now this composition could be combined with a different third legend depending on the team and the meta and how they would want to play it, but other than a little while before it's solidified, the core has always been a Revenant and an Octane. The most popular version of this composition consisted of Revenant, Octane, and a Bloodhound. Executing the strat was simple. All you had to do was find a team that you want to push, either as a third party or if you find a team holding a position, you scan with Bloodhound to find out exactly where everybody are, then place a death totem and a jump pad right next to it, followed by your entire team taking the totem and then padding into that one selected target with the intention of death balling them and getting at least one knock before everybody is sent back to the totem. Once one enemy had been down and everyone had been sent back, the Revtane team could simply take the Octane jump pad again and clean up the fight. The only counter to this composition was simply not getting knocked and dragging out the fight to the point where the shadow form from the death totem disappeared. But this was very hard to do against the teams that did it right. Rev Octane saw a lot of play on ranked and even in competitions and was even the go-to pick for some teams at one point in time. But the overall chaos from such an aggressive composition dominating the meta made every team change up their playstyles to a more passive or defensive one, and eventually there was only the odd team running it to varying degrees of success, getting to farm kills in the early to mid game, but usually having no chance of keeping that momentum into the end game due to the lack of overall defensive abilities. Another cheese composition that used to be run all the way up to professional play, albeit a lot earlier in Apex's history, is the Bloodhound Bangalore composition, with the third legend usually being something like a Wraith, a Lifeline, or a Pathfinder depending on the meta, as Pathfinder had a very broken hitbox for a little while and then eventually received a huge hitbox change that completely took him out of the meta. The comp feels pretty self-explanatory, but I'll explain it just in case. The basic strat revolved around Bangalore and Bloodhound, where the Bangalore would either smoke at their own feet or right on top of the enemies, followed by Bloodhound either using their tactical to highlight all of the enemies in the smoke with the same enemies being unable to shoot back, or Bloodhound ulting and cleaning up everything through the smokes. The meta was more common in the very early days of competitive Apex, where kill races were more common than the typical tournament, but it did see some play in the very early custom lobby tournaments before the more passive meta was established as well. If you're going to bring up Bangalore, of course I'm going to have to bring up the Soloq Goats composition. For those unaware, Soloq Goats is SHIV FPS's former competitive team consisting of Soloq grinders such as DivQ, Sypef, and of course SHIV himself. They were a hyper-aggressive team and who were also the team pioneering running a Bangalore in the heavy Gibraltar, Wraith, and Valkyrie meta. On a meta level, almost every fight revolved around forcing out Gibraltar's bubble, meaning that you wouldn't have any defense against Gibraltar's defensive bombardment, and that's where the Bangalore came into play. Of course, SHIV just handles Bangalore expertly overall, but the reason they managed to not only perform consistently, but do pretty well in the more stacked tournaments and even making Pro League was that Bangalore's ultimate and Gibraltar's ultimate both serve the same purpose, and when used, and when either one of these is used, it will force Gibraltar to pop their bubble. After the bubble was forced, the Soloq Goats would follow up with either a defensive bombardment or Bangalore's cluster to clean up the enemy team, who at this point didn't have any means of defending themselves. However, the rise of the scan meta along with Seer made the Bangalore less and less useful, and SHIV officially retired the Bangalore from competitive on January 15th, 2022. Next up is a composition that I personally have some experience with, and that's the Horizon Fuse composition. If combined correctly, Fuse's and Horizon's ultimate first off traps the enemy inside of the black hole, followed by Fuse's Marvelode creating a Ring of Fire, which stops enemies from having a single chance of trying to run away from the black hole, and if the enemy does manage to break the newt after all the focus fire and grenades, they will still stay highlighted by Fuse's ultimate and be unable to run away without some acrobatics. This cheese composition is still very strong to this day, but is the epitome of a cheese composition, since picking Fuse and a Horizon at the same time means that you're going to have to sacrifice valuable team utility. This combo works really well and will secure you up to 3 kills, but it requires all of your cooldowns, your utility, and ordinances, and as far as abilities goes, you have nothing to stay alive in the mid to late game, or if a third party rolls up right after you use your entire arsenal on that one team. And this next composition is the polar opposite of the Fuse Horizon composition, namely the Caustic and Watson composition. Normally you would choose one or the other in the so-called bunker composition, combined with something like a Wraith or Gibraltar, then rotate into the end game as early as possible using a rotational legend such as Valkyrie, and then play the late games with a Gibraltar or Wraith managing the end game rotations. But the Caustic and Watson composition doubles down on the bunker aspect while sacrificing those late game rotations. The third legend is typically a macro rotation legend such as Valkyrie, and then you're essentially gambling on where the zone will pull, in addition to the zone prediction knowledge that many pros possess to get the best position possible. Namely, one where you can keep sitting in one position without ever having to rotate for the entire duration of the game. When their defensive abilities work in tandem, that no sane team would ever attempt pushing it unless absolutely forced to, but the luck factor completely eliminates its viability in a competitive environment. Other than the cheese compositions, there's also a few cheesy strats you can approach a game with to get 1 or 2 easy kills, with the added benefit of it looking really funny. The first one being the King's Canyon Bunker Caustic Gas Trap, which is a massive mouthful to say, but it also was nerfed a little while ago, but it still works just fine. This strat includes Caustic placing a bait, usually in the form of a high-level armor or other interesting item, inside of one of these 2 items with one door. Caustic then opens the door swinging into the room and climbs on top of said door. This makes him difficult to spot from the outside, especially if the enemy is occupied with the bait placed inside of the room. Caustic then just has to wait for the target to sheepishly walk into the room, followed by Caustic dropping his ultimate into the room, running out, closing and shutting the door, and placing a few traps to stop the enemy from escaping as easily. Other than that one, there's also a few ways to cheese out a team using Wraith's portal. For example, you can start a portal over the edge of the map, then trick enemies into taking it. They will have lost all forward momentum coming out of the portal, meaning that they'll simply fall to their death. Some of the more commonly Wraith portal plays involve Wraith setting up a portal into the middle of Rampart's walls and Watson's fences, then placing the other team around a hotspot looking for enemy teams. Wraith then tries her best to bait the enemy into the portal, only to have them instantly die once they show up on the other side. If you're interested in the 43 things that are removed from Apex Legends, check out the video on the screen. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all tomorrow.
Punching a tunnel.
Shields are recharging.
Portal placed. Got a care package coming in. This team stands together.